Brought us together in your love. And if there is a word for us tonight, open our hearts to hear it. We ask in your holy name. Amen.
Amen.
So we are on to the minor prophets. And tonight I nicked the book of Jonah. And not just because it's probably the easiest one, but because it's my favorite one. And by the way, the reason why the minor prophets are called the minor prophets is not because they're any less important than the prophets like Ezekiel or Isaiah or Daniel. It's just because the Ezekiel, Isaiah and Daniel are quite long books, and the minor prophets are all little books. So it's minor in as much that it's shorter. It's not minor as in less important. In fact, I would argue that the shorter ones, in some respects, are much more important and certainly much more relevant to us in their storytelling than some of the longer ones. Now, the thing about Jonah is that it's an absolutely fascinating story, but any of us who grew up in the Christian tradition will know it so well, the being swallowed by a big fish and spat out on the land and all that stuff, that we probably miss some of the message that's in there. So what I thought I'd do this evening is just give you a different interpretation of the book of Jonah, just to see if by any chance you spot anything different in there. So bringing it up to date, Jonah is a pastor who lives and works on the Sussex coast. In fact, he lives and works in a small Sussex seaside town, pastoring a quite elderly congregation. And he's been there about 20 years and really enjoys it. Life is all about the liturgical calendar. So there's Lent and then Easter. And then after Easter, there's the festivals, there's the bring and buy sale, there's the village fete, there's all that stuff. And then there's the harvest festival in October, there's Remembrance Month in November, leads into Advent, Advent leads into Christmas, which then leads into the new year, and before you know it, you're back into Lent again, and this kind of goes on. And apart from that, because the average age of his congregation was 70, then he found that most of his time was just visiting people in their homes and checking to make sure they're okay, and occasionally supporting folk in the community. It was a nice, comfortable, a little samey sometimes, but a nice, comfortable role to have in the community, which was fine for about 20 years. And then one night, he has a dream. And in this dream, God comes to him and says, I want you to open your doors to the LGBT community. And he wakes up the next morning and thinks, what on earth was that about? A strange dream. But after he has the dream twice more, the same dream, he realizes that this isn't actually a dream, it's a word from God. So he goes to his board and says, I think God's given us a ministry. And they were like, really? They're all excited. Yeah, we need to open our doors to the LGBT community. And they look at him a bit blank-faced and go, okay, yeah, if you say so, then that's what we'll do. So they printed a few flyers, they put a few rainbows up, they tried to make the place as welcome as they could. He read up on what it was to be lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender, and nobody came. But Frank, who was the church secretary and over 84 years old, did one Sunday get up and give a very impassioned coming out story to his congregation. And it was really sweet and everybody loved it. And Jonah thought, you know what? That's probably why I had to do this. It was for Frank. That's why God asked me. And then everything went on fine for a few weeks until he has another dream. And God comes to him in a dream and says, what I want you to do is I want you to open the door to refugees. He's like, we don't have any refugees here. Not that I'm aware of anyway, but okay. So he goes back to his board and says, we've got another calling from God. And they're like, okay, at this time it's, and he said, refugees. And they're like, oh, okay. So they print a few flyers and they put up a few welcoming signs, try to make people aware that theirs is a welcoming congregation for refugees. And nobody comes. But Stella does get up one Sunday and talk about how her grandmother escaped from Germany and how she'd never had the courage to actually get up and talk about it because it was something that they just hadn't talked about in the family. And Jonah thought, that's why God's asked me to do this, because it must be for Stella, so that Stella can have some way of talking to folk about her family. Everything goes on fine for a few weeks, and then Jonah has another dream. And God comes to me in this one and says, you know what? I'm really tired of the Russians selling landmines. I want you to go over there and tell them to stop. And if they don't, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring a plague upon them. So Jonah wakes up and thinks, well, that was a very odd dream. Hopes it wasn't a message from God, but after 2 more nights of the same dream, realizes it's a message from God and goes to his board and says, if you're willing to fund me, then I think I need to go to Russia and talk to them about landmines. And again, they look at him blankly, and he says, well, apparently they sell landmines, and the people are using them, and it's children and old people that are being affected by them, and God says they have to stop, otherwise God's going to punish them with some kind of pestilence, some kind of illness. God is going to start wiping them out. And they were like, oh, this sounds pretty major. Okay. So they give him a bit of money, and he books a flight, and he gets down to the airport, and when he gets there, he starts to have second thoughts. On the drive there, he's thinking, who on earth is going to listen to me? I'm this little pastor from England, running a little church. I'm going to get to Moscow. I'm going to stand there in Red Square and say, you know, you need to stop selling landmines. They're just going to arrest me. They're going to throw away the key. This is just not, you know, there's something not right here. And he gets to the airport, and he sees the queue of people waiting for the Aeroflot plane that's flying into Moscow. And he looks at them all, and then he looks at all the holidaymakers that are waiting to go to Mallorca, and he goes up to the desk, and before he knows it, it's out of his mouth, and he says, can I change my ticket, please? And they were like, well, actually, as it happens, the Moscow flight's oversubscribed. There is room on the Mallorca flight if you want to do that. We're quite happy, unusually. And he's like, yep, that'd be great, thank you. So he gets on the flight to Mallorca, and he thinks to himself, you know what, I'll just spend a couple of weeks in Mallorca, I'll go back, I'll tell them I did something, they'll never know, we'll be fine. So airplane takes off, and they're flying out, and they've just gone over the sea, and an announcement comes over the tannoy, and it's the pilot, and he says, just to remind you, I know you've seen all the notices in the airport, but it's my duty to remind you that if you have visited any of these countries, and he gives a whole list of countries, or if you have had a connection with anybody who has just come back from visiting any of these countries, and he lists all the countries, then please make yourself known to us. And at that point, his heart suddenly falls through his stomach, and he thinks, oh Lord, yesterday I went to see Ted, and Ted had just got back from Hong Kong visiting his grandchildren, and he was all sweaty and probably flu-like, and I put it down to just him being 84 and the you know, the flight and the travel and all of that. But maybe, and suddenly Jonah's mind was working. You know what? I think God's probably given me the coronavirus as a carrier, and I'm supposed to go to Russia and give it to the Russians so that they stop selling landmines. And oh my Lord, and now instead I'm flying to Mallorca, where I'm going to give it to all these holidaymakers. So anyway, he kind of makes himself known to the air stewardess, and she very quietly says, actually, there's nothing much we can do right now, just stay in your seat. But unfortunately, one of the passengers behind him heard, and before you know it, it's round the plane, and in an absolute fit of panic, they open one of the doors and they throw him out. So it's a Bible story. This is what happens. So anyway, they throw him out of the plane, and actually he feels okay. He's falling, and he thinks, you know what, I've done the right thing. You know, I'm not infecting anyone. This is what's supposed to happen. I was supposed to go to Russia. I didn't go, so this is fine. He's falling, and he thinks, at least, you know, I know that God will catch me even if I hit the ocean, like, you know, splat. So, but as he's falling, he suddenly sees a shadow beneath him, and he lands thump on something warm and almost furry. And he opens his eyes and looks, and actually he's hit the back of a giant eagle. And this thing is bigger than Lord of the Rings eagle. This thing is enormous. And he just hangs on while this eagle flies. And it flies and flies and flies. It flies for hours. And during this time, Jonah just prays to God and says, you know what? I know this has got to be you. I know this is, no less than I deserve. Whatever you want to do, that's fine. I know that you've got me. And he comes out with this extraordinary prayer. The next thing, he finds the bird has landed, has tipped sideways. It's quite dark, it's the middle of the night, and he slides off, and the bird takes flight. And he wanders down into the nearest town to find out where he is, and it turns out that he's on the outskirts of Moscow.
Yeah.
So for the next couple of days, he walks into Moscow, and as he does so, he shouts, "You all have been selling landmines, and God is really displeased, and if you don't repent and stop selling them right now, then God is going to punish all of you." And nobody stops him. And in fact, he gets to Red Square, and he stands in Red Square and says, if you don't stop selling landmines, then God is going to destroy you. God is going to bring a plague upon you. And in Jonah's mind, of course, everyone behind him is already infected because he thinks he's got this virus and does. And then he waits for somebody to come out and to arrest him and take him away, and nothing happens. What he doesn't realize is that actually he's on the news, because after he first landed and he first started walking, a priest from a local church saw him, went behind and listened to what he said, understood the English, and before you know it, he's on the news. So so the priest then starts telling other priests, and they kind of see him en route, and they see this man walking into Moscow, and us ministers, priests, can be superstitious people, and they started whispering among themselves, maybe this is actually God telling us that of all the things that we do, that landmines are actually not right, that we can't do this. And whilst he is in Red Square preaching his little socks off, people are bringing him food and water, and he can't understand why he's not been arrested yet. And while this is going on, word has got through to Putin that this madman is in the square, and that he's talking about this plague that's going to come upon them because they're selling landmines. And Putin isn't an idiot, because he realizes that the first time one of his citizens sneezes, then he'll be on the road out of a job. Because as soon as anything happens, they'll blame him for selling landmines. So Putin decides, the best thing for me to do right now is just to ignore this, pretend it's not happening. And on the other side, what we'll do is we'll stop selling landmines, and we'll make that a Kremlin decision, so that then if anything does happen, nobody will blame me for it. So over the next couple of days, they draft some new legislation. They stop selling landmines. And God comes to Jonah in a dream and says, "You good? You can go home now. They've stopped selling landmines." And Jonah says, "So what about the plague? What about the terrible wrath that you're bringing upon them?" And God says, "No, they're okay. They're doing what I asked them to do, so I'm just going to leave them with that." And Jonah is furious. He's like, "You do realize that I'm going to go home, and they're going to think I'm a wacko. They're going to think I'm an absolute nut job. I'm going to go home, and I'm never going to hear the last of this for the rest of my life. I'm going to be the idiot that went preaching in Red Square and nothing happened, nothing at all." And it's not just about landmines. I mean, I did all this thing about LGBT people. Do you know how they treat them here in Russia? And you taught me all this stuff about refugees. Do you know how they treat refugees here in Russia? And you're just going to let them off scot-free and not do anything, and I just have to go home now? And God says, "Sounds to me like you're much more interested in your reputation than you are all of these people whose lives would be lost if they hadn't changed their mind. I think you ought to go home and think about this." And that's exactly what Jonah did. Thank you.